I'm delighted to see you all here. I'm especially delighted to see you all here because I wasn't convinced that I was going to see you all here up until about 20 minutes ago. As I sat on my train at my points failure on the way down and looked out of the window, I saw quite a lot of landscape, and I thought, there are positives to this, you know, landscape, nature, beauty. Let's enjoy that. And those are the themes that we're going to look on tonight: the landscape, climate, perhaps, and the way that we interact with it, and particularly how folklorically we interact with it. And my three wonderful panelists will be taking us on this journey through the landscape. And folklore and landscape are an interesting intersection because folklore is ultimately about who we are. It's about our sense of identity. It's about our sense of place. And it helps us to understand those things around us, our place in the landscape, our place in our communities, and we'll perhaps look at some of those things too. There are misnomers, of course, about it. There is a misnomer that folklore is just about old stuff. It's not. We will look at old stuff tonight, but we will also look at how that influences the landscape and our views of it in the modern day too. And there are a lot of myths about the landscape folklorically as well. You know, why places are named the reason that they are is very rarely the reason that you think they're named what they are. So there's a lot to unpick. Helping us to unpick this tonight are Professor Melanie Giles, a British archaeologist, academic, specialising in Iron Age Britain, so a bit of the old stuff there perhaps. Professor in European Prehistory at the University of Manchester, and a relatively new Fellow of the British Academy, having been elected in 2022. Melanie's research draws together strands of the archaeology of identity, as I've just been discussing, personhood, and studies of the landscape and place, and our place within it, as well as material, culture, and art. And Melanie uses a mix of different methodologies to look at these areas. Professor Fiona Stafford, Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Oxford, a Fellow of Somerville College, and an academic lead for the Environmental Humanities programme at Torch. Works on literature of the Romantic period and on the literary influences on modern poetry of those writers. And her research interests include late 18th, early 19th century culture, Irish, Scottish literature, and a whole range of place and nature writing, both old and new, trees, flowers, cultural history, lots of elements that we're going to be touching on tonight. Fiona has been a Fellow of the British Academy here since 2013 and is also a Fellow of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. And Professor Marilina Cesario, Professor in the School of Arts, English and Languages at Queen's University, Belfast. Marilina is looking at manuscript studies, science, mainly astronomy and the weather. Plenty of weather discussion tonight, I'm sure. But also magic and prognostications in Latin, Old English and Middle English, and the relationship between weather, health and time. She was awarded an Apex Award in 2017 by the UK's National Academies, and the year after, 2018, was the recipient of a British Academy Rising Star Public Engagement Award. And in 2023, she received a British Academy Mid-Career Fellowship. So you have a great panel of British Academy Fellows with you here this evening. Marilina is currently completing a monograph on the signs of weather in Anglo-Saxon England. And that was thanks to an award from the Leverhulme Research Fellowship. Everybody, please welcome your panelists for this evening. Welcome to you all. Melanie, I'd like to start with you, if I may. And we're going to be talking about boglands, the folklore associated with those, and particularly through one specific example, which we'll come to in a moment. But first, tell us a little bit about your own interests, how your work in archaeology began to intersect with your work in folklore.
This is a landscape that my great colleague Abby will be very familiar with. This is the Lincolnshire Cars. And as an archaeologist, I spend a lot of time looking at maps and how they've the landscape has changed over time, but also lots of other methods for investigating landscape change. And I was taught by a fantastic scholar who said to me, Mel, you've not just got to know your archaeology and your art history, you've got to know your folklore, because in the folklore you will find stories about how those landscapes have changed. And this is a perfect example of them. This is the tale of Tiddymun, a supernatural little being who is very unhappy when the landscape of the Lincolnshire Cars is drained and starts to get up to all sorts of mischief. But within the story, within the piece of folklore, we can see the consternation of political change, of the rapid change of how wetland communities live in that landscape, but also the consequences of that in terms of practical consequences, but also how they then try to deal with it through ritual. And in that story, I found lots of echoes of the kinds of things I see back in the Iron Age, of what people do in and around boglands. For them, the problem was that the boglands were growing, the peatlands were expanding in the late Bronze Age and early Iron Age, and they too had to deal with that environmental change. So folklore is full of wisdom and knowledge for me around how people have dealt with change in their lives, but also how they relate to the land.
And folklore, of course, isn't just a static script for a narrative. Folklore is fluid, it's mutable, it changes based on very many different external factors. So taking that particular example that you've just referred to there, do you find that that narrative is changed and shaped over time as the uses of the land and the landscape have changed and people's fears or concerns around it are changed too?
Yes, and obviously when we have wonderful stories like this, we can discern the crises that those communities are facing and how they are interpreting them through supernatural entities and their mischief. As an archaeologist, I'm trying to intuit that from very different signs and rituals, mainly from the paleo-environmental record that we can discern, but also from the things people put into things like rivers and bogs. And through those objects start to try and understand their relationship with those landscapes.
And you've done a lot of work, particularly around Lindo Moss, the wetlands near Manchester, and of course, everybody who hears the name Lindo is going to associate it with Lindo Man, one of the most iconic, perhaps, bog bodies that we have for a number of different reasons. So can you talk a little bit about that particular wetland, the sort of landscape, the environment that you have there, and what the significance of that particular find was for that area?
Yes, well, I work at Manchester University, and if you go into Manchester Town Hall, you'll meet the mural of John Dalton, our wonderful atomic physicist, and what he's trying to do in the mural apparently is capture a will-o'-the-wisp. And he's trying to make sense, obviously, of the science behind it, but this is a story that is wrapped around Manchester itself. And one of the other sets of bog remains I worked on, the Ashton Bog Head, another bog body from the wetlands around Manchester, takes me into very personal territory. This is my mother's watercolour of Ashton Moss. At the moment of its change into a market garden landscape, it's now under concrete, it's part of the Manchester Ring Road. But my mother was painting this when she was about 18, capturing it as a market garden place. But it's Lindo Man from the other side of Manchester, from Cheshire, that has really captivated the public imagination. A bog body found over 40 years ago, now cared for by my wonderful colleagues at the British Museum. And it's a story of a man who's lived a good life, but died a very violent death. And so one of my roles has been to try and understand the circumstances that led up to that moment of violence and really why they took him to the bog for that to happen and unfold.
What do we know? What do we know for certain about the ritual that was associated with this character, and what is still guesswork or even mythos, perhaps?
So we can say that he's a healthy man in the prime of his adult life. He's led a good life. He's had a good diet. He doesn't show the kinds of wear and tear that we find on many Iron Age bodies. But he has met with a very violent death, probably on the dome of the bog itself. It seems that they take him out to that place to die. He is knocked unconscious with a devastating blow to the head that would have been fatal, but then that's followed up with a garrotting and strangulation, and his throat is cut. So he does die a very violent death, quite rapidly, I think, from a number of hands. And I would argue, from the circumstance of his life and the ritualised manner of that death, that we're probably looking at somebody very important. But he dies in the early Roman period. People think of him as an Iron Age body, but he lives through a time of extraordinary turmoil in troops on the ground, forces coming and going. So what I don't know is, I don't know who he is. I don't know whether he's a local leader who has fallen foul of the Romans, or a cattle thief, or somebody who's committed a terrible crime, or somebody who was a sacrifice at a time of crisis and is sent as a kind of emissary to the gods when nothing else has worked. But what I do know about him and his own identity is that scrap of fox fur around his upper left arm. And that was the creative point of inspiration for the collaboration that you will see if you visit the exhibition, unfolded in the work of the wonderful Liz Ellis and Abby Flint and my filmmaker David Heap.
Let's talk a little bit more about that, and I hope everybody does get an opportunity to go and have a look around the exhibition after we finish telling you about it. But the animals, you mentioned the fox fur there as well, but of course there are far more animals than just the fox involved in this exhibition. Liz has put foxes, yes, horses, hares, corvids, a number of things in there. Why? Why are these things so important to the landscape and the way that we look at it, the folklore behind it?
When we look at Lindo Moss, I mean, if you'd have visited it after Lindo Man's discovery, you'd have seen the kind of picture that you see up there of a denuded moss ripped of its peat with the bare wood showing. That moss is a very different place today because of the restoration work being undertaken by the Wilmslow Transitions Group and the communities around the bog. And so what you're seeing in front of you is some of the new life that is growing in the bog that should be there. And it will take time, but in regenerating the plant species, the animals are coming back to the bog. And the foxes are the one land mammal that can navigate the bog because they can swim. The corvids make their home in the Carr woodland around its edge. And so the other creatures you can see in Liz's exhibition are ways of telling stories about those thriving other than human communities that make the bog their home and always attracted us as humans into those boglands. So it's a way of combining these figures that crop up in folklore repeatedly. The fox is the wily trickster, the corvid is wise but also kind of cheeky. We have our hares that are often associated with prescience and supernatural kind of foretelling. And I tasked Liz with the very difficult job of bringing this menagerie, this folkloric menagerie together around the bog edge to try and present some of those non-human voices that I think if we listen to a little bit more attentively, we can reforge our relationship with these landscapes anew.
We find all sorts of things associated with bogs, all sorts of things in bogs. Hares there you refer to as supernatural, of course. Lots of stories about witches turning into hares, lots of stories about witches associated with bogs. I know when I was researching my book on Welsh ghosts, there's a lot of very messy witch stuff going on in bogs in that part of the world.
Yeah.
What does this tell us? You use the term boglore. I like the term boglore. I think we should run with that. What does that tell us about the way that people interact with these landscapes? Because peatlands, wetlands, bogs, they're a very different landscape to what we normally have around us. What can we learn from those things?
I think that the activity that we see in the past teaches that there were many communities who made those bogs, those peatlands, their home. And we cleared them from the land. I'm sure we're going to hear more about that. And it's a lovely link with Fiona's work. So the stories we've been telling publicly in poetry and writing and enclosure and in landscape improvement narratives are often about how these are barren places. They need to be literally and physically drained of their inhabitants in order, and we cut the peat away and we'll make them productive land. But, you know, our moss foxes and our plant life, you know, now we know they are absolutely vital places that store carbon, and we need to re-wet them, and they will be part of the way in which we can address climate change. But folklore has preserved different stories. Folklore has told us different ways of living in and with that land. And so I've been working with Abby Flint recently to go back to some of that folklore and read it with an archaeological eye. What is that saying about those landscapes that can tell us now how to live differently with them and with the communities who now make them their home and care about them? And not just our other non-human inhabitants, but the human communities. And Rose's wonderful collages. This is, you know, her collage of Lindo as the Lindo bog body. And the Lindo communities describe Lindo Man as their champion. They have taken this very violent death and this person from the past, and they say it puts them on the map. It gives them something to celebrate in terms of very different heritage. And I hope I can be a small part of that.
Finally, for this section, just to bring us up to date a little bit more from what you were saying there, of course, that our use of peatlands has changed very much over time. So our interaction with the landscape has changed very much over time. Are you seeing new bog lore emerging from these landscapes?
There's always new things to find in archives, aren't there? And newspaper reports and the archaeological record itself. So yes, I think we will, you know, we need to read again, read with different eyes, different interpretations across disciplines. There's, I hope, still much to learn.
I'm sure you're right. We will return to the subject of peats and bogs in a short while, but let's move on first to trees, and one particular type of tree, perhaps, although I may touch on others. We'll see how it goes. And the meaning of trees to us as individuals within our landscape culturally. Trees are very big in folklore, of course. I've written an awful lot about yew trees recently because I was writing about churches and churchyard folklore. You're going to talk to us about oak trees, but so why are trees so important to us through our folklore in this country?
I think it's a fairly obvious answer. There's a lot of them about.
There are.
And I think also they're very distinctive. The photos I've just put together, they're just a variety of trees that you find all over the UK, all over these islands. And they have these distinctive characters which people respond to, and they always have done. And gradually, stories grow up around the trees. They have old associations. I mean, some of it is to do with older medicinal practice. You know, before penicillin, apothecaries had to know about trees, and you can see willow there. So you know, one of the associations of a willow tree is that it's a healing tree, and of course we know that salicin is the basis of aspirin. So sometimes these older stories they seem like you know, kind of fairy stories, but actually they have a link to the properties of the tree as well. But sometimes it's physical. I mean, there's holly there. Holly, as I'm sure you know, has old associations as the king of the winter. The oak's the king of the summer in terms of, if we're talking arboreal society, but the holly's the king of the winter, and it's obvious why, because it's so fresh and bright all through the winter when other trees, deciduous trees, have lost their leaves. There's the holly, and it's really kind of feisty and spiky, and so you can see it's there in just the character of the tree, really. So there are different trees there. There's a yew tree in the bottom corner. That is the Lawton yew, actually, which was famous to lots of people who were familiar with Wordsworth's poetry, because he wrote a wonderful poem called Yew Trees. And that's how this interest sort of intersects with my other interest in English literature. But it was a tree that was important long before Wordsworth. It's where George Fox preached, you know, when he was sort of doing his rounds, and very often trees were gathering places. If you've got a society where not everybody reads, you need local landmarks, so everybody can say, right, we meet at the biggest yew tree, and everyone knows where that is. So that's an example of that. So all of those different tree species there have very, very different folklore meanings, and sometimes it's to do with their environment as well. So you can see a bluebell wood there. That's an ash wood. It's a bit of ancient woodland. but the meanings of the ash, which are to do with protection, love, those kinds of things. It's kind of Venus of the woods. They take on a different meaning at certain times of the year because bluebells only appear for about 3 weeks of the year, and at that point you get a whole host of different folkloric meanings which also attach to the ash tree. So all sorts of different meanings.
Yeah, lots of meanings and lots of uses, and I suppose not just folklorically, but practically the yews are a great example. You know, yews were planted not only to provide supernatural shelter to those buried in the churchyard, but physical shelter to the church as well. They're multi-purpose things in folklore, trees. This is an island made up of 4 nations. And those 4 nations have very different landscapes, very different trees within them, and therefore, I guess, very different sets of cultural meanings. How does that break down? How do those things break down between the 4 nations? And not just how were they seen like that, but does that change and evolve over time too?
It does, yeah. This is a birch, and you can see here different birches in different parts of the archipelago. So there's one that's just a sort of little birch in a garden, which is probably familiar to many people. Then there's one in a wood that's in Somerset. And then the one with the waterfall, that's the Fairy Glen in Sligo. And then the other one is Birchwood in Scotland. And in the Irish context, they're associated with fairies, and also in Scotland as well. Birks are trees associated with liminal spaces, moving into fairyland. There's lots and lots of ballads and stories about them. So yeah, it does depend where they are as to what kind of associations they have. And the other one that I thought I'd show you this evening is the rowan tree or the rowan tree, or the quickenberry. It has lots and lots of different names, and this is a tree that is has very different character. You know, you see them along suburban streets, very pretty, but if you see them in the Highlands, they have a long tradition of being protective trees. So some of the really moving sites you see, the one in the middle is a deserted village, and there are lots and lots of those in the Highlands because of the clearances. And sometimes you just see a descendant of the protective rowan tree that was planted there because people planted them in the houses to keep the witches away and keep bad things away. So they're very, they feel very different, I think, when you see them in those kinds of places.
Today is an important day folklorically, talking about this subject. People in the room, people watching online, sorry, you're out for a moment. People in the room, what day is it today? I had a couple of answers there. I had Ascension Day at the front. What did I have back there? Oak Apple Day. Brilliant. Yes, absolutely. It is Oak Apple Day today, May the 29th, also known as Royal Oak Day, celebrating or remembering the restoration of Charles II to the throne. Can you expand on that a bit more? Tell us a bit more about the significance of this and also the customs that we find happening today, because there are still a number taking place and they have similarities relating to the tree, but they have very many differences between them too.
They do. Oak Apple Day, 29th of May, is the commemoration of the restoration of Charles II after the interregnum in 1660. Of course, oak folklore goes, long predates Charles, but the Oak Apple Day that people, is still celebrated in various villages where people go early in the morning and they collect oak apples, which are the little galls that you find on spring oak leaves. And there are various kind of very local traditions, often involving ending up in the pub, as you can imagine. And of course, Oak Apple Day is very much associated with one of our most popular pub names, the Royal Oak. And it goes back to when Charles II, after the Battle of Worcester, which is really the kind of last battle of the Civil War, he was fleeing from the Cromwellian soldiers, and he famously hid in an oak tree, the Boscobel oak, and you can see there's a picture of him doing that. And this this was sort of seen, especially when he came back, because it was a really useful story to kind of cement his position as the king. It seemed like a kind of providential escape. So the story of Charles in the Oak kind of drew on all sorts of older folklore. That I think the image that you often see on pub signs of the king's face in the oak tree, it draws on that much older medieval green man image, but also it draws on a completely different tradition, which is Caesar Augustus, who liked to wear a crown of oak leaves. So Charles is really, really clever at propaganda. So he brings together these two different things, and they fuse interestingly. You know, everybody loves an oak tree, so it was a good tree for him to choose.
Everybody does love an oak tree, and I think that's because they perhaps have so many uses in society. So they are a very significant tree. What can you tell us about that? About the number of different uses, and what surrounds the tree over time then in terms of our folklore, stories, traditions, customs, as we've just heard about, songs, tales, all of those things. What do we have?
There's so many. We could be here for a very long time. I'll just pick a few, and they're not all British. People often think of the oak tree as the national tree, but actually it's a national tree in lots of European countries. And beliefs about the oak tree you find it in Greek mythology, and Celtic as well. It's where the Druids would be, worshipping supposedly. We're told. So they're very ancient stories about oak trees. And then because it's such a sort of practical tree, because the wood's so hard, it grows all sorts of different trees. And let me have a look. Yeah, in the 18th century, for example, people started kind of collecting trees, if you like. I mean, obviously they didn't collect trees because they were already rooted in the ground, but people became very fascinated by remarkable oak trees, and there's lots and lots of stories about these. That's the Fredville oak and the Greendale oak, which was so big that the local landowner decided he could drive his carriage right through the oak tree. It didn't do it much good. But they're symbols of strength and power, and I think their meanings very much evolve. They were very much cultivated because they were the source of ships. So they're kind of, armament factories as well, which we don't tend to think of with folklore, but it's very, very important. And lots of the songs that grow up about Heart of Oak and the Navy as being associated with oak trees, it's because the ships are built of oaks.
How problematic are some of these stories in terms of their accuracy? Because for your subject, I suppose, particularly, we're looking at a very old connection between us as people and the landscape. And when we look at the folklore collectors of the Victorian and Edwardian period, predominantly clergymen perhaps, or equivalent, they were very fond of making the connections which we might dispute now. Or the Druids did it, whatever it was, the Druids did it.
They did, yep.
We go back earlier than that. A lot of people are very quick to say, a lot of the stuff that we celebrate now, a lot of the folkloric elements that we have now, they come from our individual sort of connection to nature back in pagan times. And then if you ask any of those people what the term pagan means, they don't really know. It's just, old stuff like that. So how problematic are these kinds of connections?
Well, it depends whether you find them problematic or whether you find them revealing, because very often they're revealing something about a society. Yeah. So, for example, the Rowan, which I was talking about, you do get folklorists, 18th century ones often, who are making fun and suggesting that these are the sort of stories of superstitious people who need to be told that actually, putting a bit of rowan across your cowshed is not going to keep the witches away. This is ridiculous. But actually, I think that's just a very unimaginative way of responding to a society where people didn't have emergency services, they didn't have panic buttons, and in order to kind of survive, to cope with life, you need things that you think are going to help you. So I think there are lots of ways of understanding these stories. So they might not be historically accurate, but they have another kind of truth, and they're very often telling us something about a society. I mean, it's probably overlaps with your work and yours as well, I should think. And we can learn a lot just by reading attentively. And the other problem, I think, is that very often the folklore collectors, as you say, are clergymen, and that's fine, but they're often not necessarily inward with the particular local oral culture that they're recording. So what can seem very odd to them is just because they're not quite understanding it. And very often when you're reading those texts, you can see, I mean, I always think this with Martin in the Western Islands, that the reason that he never sort of could see the statue of St. Barra that was supposed to be there was because he probably really got under the skin of the people he was visiting. So of course they're not going to show it to him. And I think you can often read that into some of those collections. I mean, I don't know what you think about that, but
No. I think you're absolutely right. And of course, as you say, these things are not problematic. They're only problematic if you approach it in terms of historical accuracy. Yeah. And folklore is not about that. No. Folklore is about personal experience. It's social history. It's our interaction with narrative and the way that they change. And that's why I'm a folklorist and you three work in academia, because it's easier at this end than it is at that end, because we can just go, oh yeah, well, you know, the reason for that is people decided that changed and therefore the story changed. So how do we find that now with trees? Are the stories changing connected with trees in the same way as they're connected with peatlands because of the way that the landscape changes?
They are, and let me just flick back. There we are. That's a good example of a tree that, you know, changed its meaning overnight. So there are stories that change all the time with trees, and obviously in our current sort of environmental crisis, trees are changing, but they're changing all the time, and you know, things that seem to be kind of very old traditions, like Apple Day, for example, was actually kind of started in the middle of London in the 1990s. So things start up because people need, in some way, to have this particular association with a tree, and they continue to change their meanings all the time.
Yeah, and we find it now, of course, with wassails as well, don't we? You know, where wassailing trees would take place traditionally in an orchard, and now we wassail outside off licences, or we wassail the high street shop. You know, and these things change, and we'll come back to bring this up to date later on as we start to link all of this together. Thank you, Fiona. Marilina, we're sat here in the British Academy. It being the British Academy, of course, we have to talk about the weather, because that's what we do in Britain.
We're all obsessed, aren't we?
Yeah. We are completely obsessed with the weather. So let's obsess about the weather for the next few minutes. And tell us a little bit about your work in this area, and particularly in the early medieval period, and how people there are responding to what they see in the sky, what they feel around them in terms of the weather and climate, and how it changes.
Well, if we go back 1,000 years ago to the early medieval period, which is the period roughly between 500 and 1100, and that's the period I'm interested in, they were absolutely obsessed with the weather, no surprise. And weather was more than a matter of just meteorology. It was much more than that. It was a very powerful force, and it was woven into the fabric of political authority and religious belief. So there was way much more than observing, for example, rain or storms. They had much more meaningful interpretations that were behind that. So obviously, when we think about early medieval society, we think about a highly agricultural society, so extreme weather events, you know, for example, harsh winters or excessively hot summers would have devastating effect on an agricultural society. So failed harvest meant famine, so storms and floods meant death, illness, and economic collapse. So that was, from a practical point of view, that was very, very important. But we also have the other aspect. We have the idea that, again, storms and rain and all these atmospheric phenomena were not simply natural events. They were also thought as signs that needed to be interpreted. And if there were imbalances in the sky, that meant that that was a reflection on what was happening in real life. So weather phenomena became also, in a sense, portents and signs to be read and to be interpreted. And that's why you find records of weather phenomena in all types of texts that you can think of from the early medieval period. It can be calendars, it can be saints' lives, it can be poems, it can be any genre or text. And another important thing that we want to think about is that meteorology was a wide term in the late antique and early medieval period. It didn't just refer to weather phenomena, it also referred, for example, to astronomical events, comets, solar, lunar eclipses, but also terrestrial events like earthquakes, which were believed to be caused by the wind, shaking the crevices of the earth and making it tremble. So in this sense, weather phenomena, what I find fascinating is they occupy this liminal space between the heavens and the earth. So it's not surprise that they become also important signs for early medieval people.
So we're very good now at keeping records about the weather. You know, the Met Office keep records about everything to do with the weather. They may not be able to predict it terribly well all the time. It's a chaotic system, after all. Why would you be able to predict it completely? But you can keep records about what has happened afterwards. You're working in a much earlier period, so what does the record look like for there, both in terms of the weather, but also in terms of people's relationships with it?
Mm-hmm. Well, there are quite a few records of what the weather looked like. And I would say the main source is probably the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which is the early historical text written in Old English in the vernacular language. And it's like an annal, so basically the monks for every year recorded the most important historical events. But alongside that, we do find records of the weather and also of astronomical phenomena. And if you look at the slides here, I've given you some examples. Like for the year 1086, for example, after a description of historical events happened during that period, we do find descriptions of what looked like was a very terrible year in terms of weather and cattle plague, corn and crops were destroyed. And the chronicle tells us there was such a great misfortune with the weather as cannot be easily conceived. So there were big thunderstorms and lightning. So you can see that we do find all these records, and those are fundamental or important for us because that's the only way we get a sense of what the weather was like there. And I do love, for example, for the year 1086, that the chronicler ends with this kind of religious invocation, may God Almighty make things better when it is His will. Mm-hmm. And that really shows you again how the weather is incorporated within this Christian theological framework, nearly a kind of theological barometer, if you, as a way of thinking, about it. And also, in the other year, after lots of falling stars had been observed, then again, you have what, and I find it fascinating, what the scribe refers to as unseasonable weather. And in my research, I've found this description a lot, also in continental chronicles. Obviously, they didn't have a sense and a notion of climate change, but I wonder if unseasonable, in a sense, obviously refers to something that was unexpected, that didn't match the reports, the records that they had for previous years. So in a sense, it's very close, not to what we think of as climate change.
So what else can we learn from these older medieval records in terms of both the weather and the interaction that people have with it?
You can learn lots of things because, and I think you can learn, they help us understand how they saw the world around them in a way that the weather, again, is integrated within both the theological and political landscape. And we do find lots of references, for example, in which some weather phenomena act as portents of some historical events that happened. So we do have, for example, strong winds. There was a very strong wind, and the Archbishop of Lincoln died, for example. We know that there is no direct connection unless a tree fell on the Archbishop. But the connection is obviously that idea of portent, of portentous nature. So I think it really makes us understand how all these elements of religion, magic, and science, they were all at play together. And I think the weather really occupies a very important place in that.
I can't help but come back to the idea of wind, because you've mentioned it twice now, and I feel that this is something that we need to unpick a little
Yes.
more.
Sorry.
Wind, you've already mentioned the shaking and this sort of thing, so we have a very symbolic aspect to it, and you've mentioned a religious aspect, both in terms of the bishop's death, but also there are other aspects as well. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Winds were, among all the weather phenomena, were the ones that fascinated early medieval people the most. And it's not surprise, because they are unpredictable. They're very strong, powerful forces. They can be both positive in the sense of helping people sailing, but they can be very destructive if you think about strong winds. And they obviously required also religious meaning. And Isidore of Seville, a 7th century scholar, for example, refers to the north wind as connected to Satan for different reasons, to the devil. One, because once Satan was banished from paradise, apparently he established his throne in the northernmost part, of the heavens. But also this idea of cold and cold of iniquity, and how the devil hardens the hearts of believers, that's associated with the idea of the north wind. By contrast, the south wind is linked to grace and warmth and to the Holy Spirit. So again, you've got this kind of dual aspect linked to winds. So winds really feature very, very prominently in their worldview.
I mentioned earlier the difficulties involved in predicting the weather, but we have old folkloric sayings for doing things like this and for trying to understand what's going to happen. So if we were going to go back to the medieval period and turn on our medieval television and look at a medieval weather forecast,
Yes.
what are we going to see?
Well, I'll show you, before I get to a medieval weather forecast, can I just show this beautiful diagram that is here, which I think really exemplifies the medieval worldview and how the weather and all other elements feature into that. In the center, you've got the church, obviously the ecclesiastica rota, then you have the 4 elements, and then you do have the 4 winds and the name of Adam, which is made of 4 letters, which is the center of the world. And I think that really tells you about this kind of holistic view of climate and weather, that everything has to be in this sort of perfect balance, to be working well. But just to move to what a weather forecast would look like, it would look like something like that. This is a weather prognostic text, which tells you the weather for the whole year. They didn't have a daily forecast or hourly forecast as we have today. They couldn't use Alexa. They didn't have any app at their disposal. But this is the closest we get to a weather forecast, which is basically foretelling the weather and other phenomena based on the day of the week on which the 1st of January falls. So this year, the 1st of January fell 2025 on a Wednesday. So if that is right, and if you don't mind if I can read it, then this is what should happen. Then if the 1st of the year is on a Wednesday, there will be a hard winter and a bad spring, a good summer, and crops will be afflicted, and honey will be insufficient. So I haven't tested it, I haven't tried, I don't know if it's true. But that would be the closest, and this is one of the most popular medieval texts ever copied and produced. It exists in hundreds of copies in all vernacular languages that you can imagine, from the 8th to the 16th century.
We think now that we have a quite good understanding of the weather and climate, at least we hope we do. Like many things, we have a much better understanding now than people of the medieval period did. So how would their understanding have differed to our own, and how would they have interacted with the weather?
I don't think it's very different, because I think one thing in common that we're starting to realize is that weather, again, is more than just meteorology. There are lots of other phenomena attached to it, and we need to look at different aspects, at different elements to keep that balance. And I think in that sense, when they talk about unseasonable weather again, they were wondering, what do we need to do to fix it? This means that something is wrong. Obviously, they weren't thinking about pollution, for example, but they were thinking about maybe moral behavior or degradation. But in a sense, we need to do something that, because all the other stuff is affecting that. And as human beings, we are at the center of all of this, and we need to act and do something. So in that sense, I think there is this kind of holistic view of not looking at the weather in isolation. So this to me seems quite similar to the way we are learning to understand it.
I'm going to throw this open shortly for questions, so get your thinking heads on. But in the meantime, I just want to open the discussion up to the three of you. How does anything that you've heard from your fellow panelists between yourselves this evening kind of resonate and go, oh, do you know that's the same in my area? How are these things linking together for you and perhaps bringing all of this into the modern period? Anybody?
I suppose I think, listening closely to trees and weather, the thing that would bring that together for me as an archaeologist is the records we have in dendrochronology, where bad weather takes its toll on trees, and we rely on that as archaeologists for our not just fine-grained dating, but a fine-grained understanding of what the environment was doing on a year-by-year basis. So I love archaeological science because it gives us suddenly these year-by-year palpable records of the kinds of phenomena that so troubled people, theologically and emotionally, as we've been hearing.
And for me, was also thinking about, your talks and trees in particular, how, again, trees feature constantly also in descriptions of weather, for example, and the importance of safeguarding trees as well. But also the association, again, we have a beautiful poem, which is The Dream of the Rood, in which is a piece of wood that represents the cross. And I think in that sense, that kind of sacrality, that kind of aspect comes across. So I think in that sense, there are lots and lots of links, between what has been said.
I think there's an interesting link here between all of your different areas as well, in terms of the way that in modern times we look at them. We have climate change, we have change in the use of the landscape in peatlands, we have deforestation and the change in planting of particular types of trees, not just in this country but in the rainforests and everywhere else as well. And all of that also suggests to me modern protest in all of those areas. And protest is a very big part of folklore as well, of course, through song and through story. But is that just a modern thing, or did you find the same thing, that people are protesting, maybe not so much with climate, but certainly in terms of trees and land grabs and land use back in other periods? Was that a big thing?
I think it's always been a big thing, hasn't it? Yeah, and I think when people see changes going on, especially if they don't feel that they have power to influence the changes, that's when people protest, and you see that with people being kind of moved off their the land that they've had for a long time, with enclosure, for example, or example that I was thinking of when you were talking about the Lindow is the draining of the fells and of the fens, and the draining of the meres, and the impact that has on local people, the fishermen, people who for generations their family have been working with that particular landscape, and then suddenly it's not there anymore. And you get poems, you get songs, you get stories. People they just have always burst out in response to these things, I think.
Let's take some questions. We have a microphone, if you hold on for just a second. Somebody will bring it to you.
Hello. Lots of.
I can't tell.
Can you hear me?
Now I
Oh,
can.
no, it's a bit closer. Lots of questions I could answer, but one particular one about bogs. It seems to me that as we find stuff preserved in bogs, that people in the past would likely have found stuff preserved in bogs as well. Is there kind of any evidence that they were doing that gave them a sense that some sort of supernatural quality in bogs, that they could resist death or resist deterioration or something, either in a written record or in a kind of physical record of why things were being put in bogs?
Yes, it's very clear to me as an archaeologist that they were doing their own archaeology. They were encountering things that were magically or marvellously preserved and making their own sense of that. The one example that we have palpably in relation to human remains is the Cloudhallen body from the Outer Hebrides on South Uist, where we have a formal burial underneath the roundhouse floor, which Mike Parker-Pearson and his team realised was the remains of 3 individuals. The main body of one person and other bits from 2 others. It's male and female, it's young and old, but the main body has been preserved by being immersed in a bog for decades, possibly a century, out with one normal life cycle, brought back out again, and then created as what Mike has argued is a composite ancestor, a supernatural, super powerful being that is then going to protect and look after the house that's built over the top of it. But examples of things like churns of bog butter, people are finding that in the early medieval period that has been deposited in the Iron Age period. In places like Denmark, we know we have people reiteratively dropping rings or pieces of jewellery into still bog pools. And those are the gestures of dozens of people over decades of life. And because of the still quality of a bog pool, there are things you can see in its depths that remain visible for a long time. So just as our antiquarians, our clergymen, were puzzling over the things that were coming back out of the bogs as we drained them, people in the Iron Age are digging the peat for fuel. The earliest peat briquettes we have are late Bronze Age in date. They would have been finding their own things, marvellously preserved organic plant matter, as well as things made by human hand. Tools they kind of recognised, but were out of memory, out of time. So yes, I think the bog has been working its magic on us for a long while.
And can I just follow up on that? Were people putting things in for good luck? Because that's where it kind of immediately links to trees, where you have, what are called wishing trees, where people kind of put nails or coins into old trees in the belief that this is somehow going to bring them luck, or it's going to heal somebody, those sorts of things. I mean, do we know whether that's what they were doing?
Yeah, my communities I work on they're non-monetary communities. They are exchange communities. They take all sorts of things from the bog. We see them as wastelands, but they grow bog ore. They yield moss that can heal wounds. They create woodland around its edge that enables us to engage in complex craft working. And strange things are seen on them. Strange encounters are had. So when you take things from the bog, you need to give something back. That's, there are other beings you're dealing with there. So yes, I think there's a gift giving that, we find cauldrons, torques, textiles, butter, and that has been going on for a long time. Barry Raftery, a professor of the Iron Age, as a young scholar out in the Irish landscape, watched a farmer chuck butter into a lake. And he said, can I just ask why you're doing that? And the farmer said, oh, well, sure, the cattle came through the winter. As if that, and that was, he was still giving the cream of life back to whatever lived in those lakes that had kept his cattle watered and looked after through the winter. So these things are never far from the surface. And some of those traditions, quin trees, we know are quite a recent phenomenon. We're being encouraged now not to do that because that kills trees, and it's not good for the Giant's Causeway, it turns out. So don't do that. There are other kinds of disposable, decayable organic offerings you can make instead. But yeah, I think that is that wishing well to things is crossing time.
Marilyn, do we find the same thing with people trying to influence the weather?
Yes, we do in some legal text from the 9th century. We do find some laws against people trying to change the weather. And also in saints' lives, that's only saints can do that. They can change, for example, the direction of the wind according to what suits them through God's intervention. So these are, yes, the references that we would find the most. But yes, there are some laws against people trying to change the weather according to their own benefit.
Anybody else? We can take questions from online or from in the room. Yes, back there.
Thanks very much. That was all fascinating. I'd like to come back to this notion of change and its interaction with folklore. Some of what you've talked about presents folklore as a way for people to witness and record and make sense of change. And of course, today we live in a time of great change, of polycrisis, which has environmental, social, political dimensions. And I'd be really interested in your intuition for how folkloric practice helps us today make sense of how we see the world changing, and what the study of folklore can tell us about how we can do that better, how we can use folklore and folkloric practices to re-engage with a world that's fundamentally quite scary and anxiety-inducing.
How can we use folklore and folkloric practices to re-engage with the world?
Most of those folk tales involve some kind of journey or difficulty or trial. There's loss along the way, usually. In the folk stories, people normally emerge wiser beings, more empathetic. You know, we grow as we undertake those things. So I love folklore for reminding us that, you know, trials have been faced through time, change has been faced through time, and human agency is potent and powerful. And, you know, it is most folk stories they have their own kind of strange activism within them, and they might be gestures that you make, or appeals, or intercessions, or offerings. You know, that's a motif for us today in different kinds of way. So yeah, I'm always learning from my folk tales.
Yeah, and I think in a lot of folklore, lots of stories, you encounter people who are very attentive to our surroundings and our natural world and the details of them. I mean, even just Oak Apple Day, for example, that's you know, people who are looking sufficiently closely at an oak tree to spot the apples, the little tiny oak galls, and do something with them. And I think that kind of attentiveness to natural phenomenon, that is something that can teach us such a lot and be such a kind of hopeful thing. And I think, I mean, those tree protests, this connects to the protest question. There is a sort of reverence sometimes in folklore for long-lived natural phenomenon, which I think we can learn a huge amount from. I mean, one of the things that is much debated is, you know, obviously infrastructure projects, new housing estates, all this kind of thing, and the kind of environmental impact on that. And there are the mitigation kind of policies in place, so that if you chop this down and that down, you have to plant so many saplings. But the equation between an ancient woodland and some little saplings, I mean, it's just completely overlooking the sort of enormous complexity of an ecosystem and the biodiversity that's there. So I think sometimes we learn from a story that might have a mushroom or something like that to look really carefully, and you can just be going through a kind of normal woodland and you're looking carefully, and it's just full of life. And you know, I think the more we can sort of understand how to live with all the other sort of living organisms we share the planet with, that's got to be helpful to us from now on, I think.
And following from what Fiona was saying, again, this attention to detail, and I can give you an example in my own work, because, for example, in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 793, they describe fiery dragons flying in the sky, and they've always been dismissed as, not folklore, but they've been dismissed as maybe like apocalyptic signs, but actually studies have been done which have shown that that could be the reference of a first record of an aurora borealis ever recorded in England. So I guess, there is so much that we can learn from that, and I've worked a lot on this particular annal with astrophysicists, and what seemed like a random description in reality can also mean them observing the world around them and observing the sky. And they didn't have the words for an aurora borealis, they didn't know what that was, but they observed something different in the sky. So in the sense, yes, totally agree with what's been said.
So this event is part of a series called Folklore Reimagined. Are we actually reimagining it at all, or are we just watching it change and shape and develop? Anybody?
Well, I think we're imagining it,
Yeah.
aren't we?
Yes, I think we're imagining.
Yeah. I don't think we're necessarily always reimagining something old. We continue to
We
imagine,
continue,
I
yeah, I
hope.
agree, yeah.
Yeah.
And people always have done. And I think being attentive to that is it's just very helpful. It's not only kind of hugely enriching and enjoyable, but we learn so much from it as well.
Not least perhaps how to work with, you know, from as an academic, how to work with extraordinarily creative people, because they make you see your own work in a different light. And they also remind you there's nothing like a good story.
And that's a really interesting point as well, because the resurgence of interest in folklore, which isn't a new thing, it happens probably generationally for different reasons, post-war nostalgia, all of these things. But the current sense of interest in folklore brings with it a lot of that, a lot of creativity, a lot of artists working with the subject, a lot of musicians working with the subject, all sorts of different things. So that's an area that's ripe for exploration, I guess, for all of you in your work as well. We've got time for, we have a question from somewhere that isn't in the room. We certainly have time for that.
Yes, we have 2 online questions, if that's okay. So the first one is, are there any particular wetlands or woods whose folklore has been under-researched or is at risk of being forgotten? And the second question is, are there any folk tales based around the weather? Thinking of a couple of film examples like The Wicker Man and Midsummer, which are based on the topic of harvest.
Okay, let's take the first of those questions first then.
I think any wetland has its own locked store of stories, and one of the things I found very useful as an archaeologist is the opening up of newspaper archives, because I think stories are often in there of discoveries that we don't know about. They become paper records. Abby's lovely poem on the paper hand is the story of one of those discoveries. So for me, there, you know, any wetland will have its own boggy archive that is ripe for reinvestigation. And often we compartmentalise these things. We put, you know, folk stories in one basket and folk song in another, and it's that kind of ability to see these all as different ways of telling stories about those locales.
And woodland, any areas that have been underexplored that we should be looking at?
I think everywhere's been underexplored. I mean, I think there's just always more to find if you're asking the right questions or you're looking in an attentive way. And I think, I think local newspapers, local histories, they're all full of clues. But so are kind of place names, and I know, as you warned us, you have to be careful about place names. But they will often take you. They often have little stories within them. So I think pretty much everywhere. But I do think it's really helpful if you can to go and just be in the place and walk around. I think you kind of discover things by you know, just being in the physical environment, which are a bit different from what you might find online or whatever.
Place names are like a Wikipedia page. You don't cite them in your essay, but you use them as a springboard for other things.
Yeah, well, they'll often tell you something that's been there. I mean, you might discover that there has been a holy well somewhere, which was kind of, you know, covered over 200 years ago, but it might still be there in the place name. So there's often a little kind of story within, you know, within the name.
And Marilina, folk tales associated with the weather?
I'm not sure there is, for the early medieval period, any particular folk tale, but one thing that was very important to them was observing the different colors of the moon, and that would give an indication of what the weather would be like the day after. So the moon had different colors. So I'm not sure, but there is one specific, you know, folk tale, but it was mainly, yes, associated with the colors of celestial phenomena like the moon in this particular case.
We need to wrap up in a couple of minutes. Before we do, I'm just going to ask you all one final question for which you are completely unprepared, because I didn't tell you I was going to ask it, but I just want to see what the response is. So I'd like to ask each of you, from the work that you do in your area, what is your particular favourite folkloric connection to it, and why does it resonate with you? Melanie.
I think it would be the tale of Tidymon, the little being who is so cross about the drainage of the Lincolnshire fens, because in order to appease him, the people go out at full moon. No, it's the new moon, and that made me go and look at tides, and new moons, like full moons, are associated with high tide, so the water is high, and they're all taking out their little bucket of water, and they're pouring it out symbolically at the cross dykes, and then suddenly they hear the sound of the piewipe, which is the local bird that is also the sound of unbaptized infants being released from their purgatory, and there's so much in that story that's about crossroads, about symbolic rewetting, about infant death and mourning and grief, environmental grief, all in one story. And when it was written down, I don't think Mary Balfour understood all of that, and yet as an archaeologist I can pick out moments in the landscape, places in the landscape where meaningful things happened that now are lost to us. So Tidymon.
Thank you. Fiona.
I think I'd be very hard pushed to choose one, but we haven't talked all that much about yew trees, have we? And I think they are absolutely astonishing because of their antiquity. I mean, they can just live for, we think, thousands of years, and because they have this astonishing ability to regenerate. So it's very interesting, I think, the yew trees that you find. I mean, you can find things like the Borrowdale yews that are very, very ancient, and they're just in Borrowdale on the hillside in Cumbria. But you also find them in churchyards, and I think the stories that grow up around them, often in churchyards, and this links to what you're saying about pagan being a long time ago, they've often become Christianized in very interesting ways. So it's possible that some churches were sort of on the site of existing holy places and ancient trees, and then the yew trees get reimagined in terms of everlasting life, which ties up with their sort of habit of regeneration. So it's that kind of story that's not a specific one yew tree, but it's everywhere.
And Marilina, finally.
I do really like the way the weather is popularized in saints' lives. And I do like, for example, there is a particular story in the life of St. Columba in which he's sailing with all the other monks, and at some point the weather is really bad and they're all stressed out, they haven't got any food, and then the other monks ask, why don't you pray and ask for the north wind to go away so we can get the west one, so it can help us sail? And then you do have the saint through his prayers performing all of that. But what is interesting is the idea that obviously saints' lives were used to preach to lay people, and they were popularized. So in that sense, I guess that would be the closest to folklore, in that sense in which the weather is used to promote, obviously, the sainthood of that particular person and to promote a particular idea. So you do have this strange, you imagine these saints moving one wind from one place to another, and then you just places them. And so I do find it quite interesting and funny as well, some of those stories. So for me, that would be one of the most interesting ones.
Thank you. We have to leave it there. Thank you all for coming. Please do not leave the building unless you really have to without going to see the exhibition at the very least. But please do thank my panellists, Melanie Giles, Fiona Stafford, and Marilina Cesario for their contributions to this final discussion in the Folklore Reimagined series. And thank you all for coming.